race, religion, flight lines, flight times, can't read my own writing, whether the garage is full, who is in the cars or who is coming out of the cars, what traffic conditions might be like, what the TSA times might be like. And of course, there's many, many more, and something we'll talk about later is you'll have access to all of these answers after the event. That's part of why we're collecting them now, so you can continue to kind of iterate and think about that. So like I said, this was activity 1, and from now we're gonna move on, and Hanson is going to introduce our next speaker.
Great, thanks, Thank you. Thank you for being, good sports and trusted members of our community to even attempt this activity. It's also intended to actually get you thinking concretely about what does this AI really mean, and can you apply it to a real-world solution, and also to even collaborate with your table mates. So I mentioned that it was inadvertent that we actually have 2 speakers from Microsoft. We were just looking for the best people to present this content. It's also exceptionally inadvertent that we have 2 speakers who have the same last name, Narayan. They're not related, though I was thinking if we ever wanted to do like a CNN's Crossfire type show, the 2 of them would go at it, and they definitely have different opinions on that. So we have another Narayan, Shankar Narayan, who we're very lucky to have. I actually met him through one of our students who had met him downtown and said, hey, you should meet Shankar. He's quite amazing. And I took that recommendation very seriously, and a few months ago we had lunch, and just hearing how he sees and thinks about technology and holding what he calls the big 5 or tech companies accountable, especially from a privacy, ethical, inclusion point of view, is just remarkable. My brother, by the way, is the head of Privacy International out of London, and he's constantly working against governments and companies to try to figure out how do we make sure that people are protected. So I have a bias towards thinking this way. And I also think it's really important that even as we explore the opportunities and potential about how these technologies will make our lives better, we have to think critically, and we have to think about who's impacted by this. So to have Shankar, who is the Technology and Liberty Project Director, head of ACLU of Washington, is really important. He's also a poet, which is great. I think you're going to be doing some prose, not rhyme. But to talk about the potential impact of our choices. I mentioned that all of our speakers will be around all day, and we'll be bringing them up along the way as we have these conversations. Shankar cannot. They're in legislative session right now in Olympia, so he's got to leave after. So we've given him a little bit more time to really unpack some of these questions, and obviously, based on what we've heard so far, people are interested in this. Shankar will introduce somebody who will join him on stage a little later, Theresa Crecelius, who's from the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, to talk more about this. So with that, Shankar Narayan from the ACLU. Is this my clicker? Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Excellent. So I am really grateful to Hanson for having brought me into this conversation, although not so happy that I have competition for the Narayan brand. I'm used to being the only Narayan, and I feel a little slighted. But I just had a conversation with Vinay, and we're actually not necessarily as much at loggerheads as you might imagine. So, I would like to bring in, and can we bring my slides up, please? Okay, there we go. I would like to bring into this conversation, I think, some words that were pointed to by some of the last few questions that came out of the audience. Those words are power, privilege, and values. And I think how you respond to my presentation is, I think, directly proportional in some ways to how much you think our current brick and mortar world is shaped by those things, shaped by power and privilege. I've been told as well that I was sort of brought into this conversation to be the reality check. And I think the opinions that I'm expressing here are not just those of the ACLU, and not just my personal opinions, but also opinions that we've been working to develop with a large coalition that's now over 50 organizations of community-based groups that have historically been over-impacted by surveillance. And so part of my job, I think, today is to tie back some of what you've heard this morning, some of the conversations about technology and its benefits, to the counterpoint about how this can and is going wrong in ways that over-impact people who are on the wrong end of those power and privilege equations. So, we're talking a lot about AI, what it can do. We're talking about data privacy. That conversation has sort of reared its head. In 2018, we have started to talk about, the impact of groups like Facebook on speech and democracy. But I think what we rarely speak about are these underlying equations of power and privilege, bias within the technologies themselves, which, can be pervasive, and we'll look at that a little bit more. But also, even if you have perfectly functioning technologies without bias, how do those technologies reshape the equation in our democracy, reshape our relationship with government, for example, and our relationship with each other? So I'm going to advance through a basic set of propositions to just kind of give us a little bit of a common language to think about these issues with, and then do a little bit of a deeper dive into one specific space, which is policing, surveillance, and the criminal justice system. So proposition one, that if you remember nothing else from this talk, please remember this, that there really is no neutral way to build a technology. Every technology, from the simplest to the most complicated, is a set of value choices. There's an example of an overpass that was built. There was a designer of overpasses who built low overpasses, right? You'd say, well, what's the value choice in that? The choice is that buses had a hard time passing under because cars were seen as the way of the future, right? Individual vehicle ownership was the thing that was privileged by building underpasses lower. All the way to the most sophisticated artificial intelligence tool you can make. It's all a set of value choices, and there's no single good neutral way to do that. The flip side of all of the data needed to run AI is the fact that there's just a lot more data about every one of us out there, right? I call it data hemorrhage. It's massive and it's game-changing. Just to live a modern life, you need a cell phone, you do business on the internet, you have your Orca card, you're surveilled in public places, and this data matters a lot more because it's aggregated, so there's more data talking to each other in one place. And on top of that sits analytics, right? So you've kind of heard this morning a little bit about how AI works. I won't bother you with the various categories into which it falls. But for my sort of very practical purposes, one of the main things that's commodified and bought and sold is the ability to predict people's future behavior, right? Not just what is, but what will be. Predictive analytics, which is a subset of AI and machine learning. So that's the world we're moving into, and these tools largely are already playing a significant role in where we are in society, right? Determines our power and place in the society. I think we had a baseball conversation earlier about which base we're on in terms of the AI conversation. Are we on first base, second base? Which inning are we in? I would say that we are more advanced in terms of adopting these technologies than most people realize. Virtually every major decision about a person, from whether you get credit, who considers your resume, does your resume make it through the first cut? Is your housing application approved? How are you policed? What is your sentence once you are policed? Right? All of these have some algorithmic component to them, either an autonomous one, right, where AI really does make the decision, right? It just cuts your resume out and no human being ever reviews that decision. Or where, for example, a risk assessment is put in front of a judge and that judge has to make a decision about a sentence for a person or bail for a person, looking at the recommendation from the machine. And even in that case, remember there's a human actor involved as well, right? So it's not as simple as saying AI is aiding that decision, because for a politically elected judge, how likely is that judge going to be to depart from the recommendation of the machine? So there's an entire set of human actors involved in this conversation as well. And the reach of automated decision-making tools fed by surveillance technologies is actually quite pervasive even now. You don't have much control, and I hate to break it to you all, but unfortunately our legal frameworks have not kept up in this space, right? We as you've heard, the big five and other companies are sitting on massive troves of data. our legal frameworks have not kept up. It is very difficult to bring a case when you don't know a system is operating. And we have no transparency frameworks that mandate notifying the public when automated decision-making played a role in how they're treated, say, by their government. And of course, if you don't know, facial recognition played a part in your arrest or capture by ICE. You can't challenge that either. So control is lacking. This is a slide that I think is incredibly important. A point that I started making a number of years ago when I think folks were more skeptical about this idea. The narrative is our brick and mortar systems are biased and broken, and they often are. But what follows from that in terms of the narrative is, well, tech is going to come in and fix those biases because tech is supposed to be neutral and unbiased. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily proving to be the case, and I'll take you through some examples of why that is. But unfortunately, if we don't put the value structure in place before implementing the technology, it turns out that often the historic biases in the system either go through the data and cause the tool to amplify the biases, make them worse, or even a perfect system is targeted to certain communities and has a disproportionate impact in that way. So, I'm teaching, unfortunately, over at your rival school, SU Law, a class on ethics and technology, and I realize the entire course could have been about what bias is, what it means. There are dozens of definitions of bias. There isn't just one. And by definition, some of them cannot coexist with each other, right? That they're in opposition to each other. So in some ways, I found it more useful to start talking not about what bias is and isn't, but if you calibrate a given tool in a particular way, who wins and who loses, right? And if you calibrate it differently, how does that change the winners and losers? And who is making the decision about who wins and loses? Is it a data scientist within the black box of a technology vendor? Or is it the communities that are most impacted by that particular piece of technology being deployed in their community? So that's really where I'm driving this conversation with the help of, I think a large coalition of community-based organizations that feel that they have very little control in this space, is really making sure that we're checking our assumptions when we're building these technologies. And this is, there's a lot of research on this. No need to read the small print, but everything from predictive policing to risk assessments, facial recognition, DNA algorithms, child protective algorithms, and an almost infinite number of other kinds of automated decision-making tools have been studied, and it's hard to find one. Even those that are built to try to combat bias, it turns out it's very difficult to do that in a way that is sustainable for all groups. Lots of research, no clear fix. This looks like my desk on any given day. There's books, there's papers, and there's also in this space a process problem that I want to point out about how technology is often deployed in the public space, right? How government makes decisions about where to deploy technology. And how it often happens is government entity is cash-strapped. A vendor shows up and says, look, here's our system. You currently have 8 caseworkers who have to be on the phone with people assessing their individual situations to determine how many hours they get to spend with their disability caseworker, right? These people have to individually assess how many hours this person is entitled to. We're going to help you get rid of those 8 decision makers and actually put in place an algorithm that will do that for you. It doesn't take long before the government person says, where do I sign? And yet, often the person in the government entity who is accountable to the public through things like transparency laws, the Public Records Act, may not know how the system works, may not be able to answer how the system is actually determining who's eligible or not. The only person who does may be within the vendor. And that leads to this black box factor where the same standards that are supposed to apply to the government don't apply to the vendor that's doing the work of the government. So there's this sort of black box effect. I don't know how many of you read XKCD, but a person is standing on a mountain of garbage, and the other person says, well, this is your machine learning system. What if the answers are wrong? The answer to that is just stir the pile until the answers start looking right, right? So not to rag on your tools, Vinay, but often when you open the hood and look underneath, as we have, because we've won cases in which, for example, a DNA predictive algorithm was opened up, and they put the code up on the internet, and the internet lit up, right? Because I think one person compared it to sort of a shoebox with duct tape around it. And this was the software that was being used to send people to jail, right? So it is also a studied phenomenon that people tend to overtrust data, right? Things with the veneer of science. And in some ways that can actually drag us back to places in our conversations that have actually, we thought we'd left behind because they were discredited by the social scientists, the social science, but because it's data, we trust it more. I won't bore you with lagging legal frameworks. I will say that there's a cycle that happens here where these tools tend to over-focus on particular communities. For example, and don't read the small print, it's very small, but I think you'll have access to this presentation if you want to. But for example, a tool that deploys policing resources based on historic arrest data, right? That's sort of the classic example where, as it turns out, arrest data historically doesn't track where crime happens, it tracks where you look for crime, right? And so historically, over-policed communities tend to have more arrests. The policing tool says, well, send your resources there. Guess what? More arrests, right? And that's exactly the metric the tool then again focuses on to focus resources back on that community. This is not new. This has been the pattern for a very long time. Malkia Cyril from Color of Change is a celebrated voice in that space who talks about how there's a long history of the use of surveillance tools against communities of color. That man, Martin Luther King, had a dossier, as did virtually every major leader in the civil rights movement. Infiltration was used, bugging was used, even their form of fake news where the government would send a fake letter purportedly from one activist to another with the stated goal of breaking up the civil rights movement. So we shouldn't simply assume that everyone who gets their hands on these tools is going to use them the right way. And another great example from Stanley Shikuma from the Japanese American Citizens League, talking about, speaking with incarceration survivors who said, look, I was a loyal American, but I couldn't avoid being incarcerated because my crime was my face. Guess what? We are now talking about automated facial recognition systems in the hands of government. And the question is, how should this history influence that decision? This is, I think, an important slide simply because these are issues we've seen come out through our conversations with the community-based organizations we work with. Targeting of those particular communities, for example, after 9/11, there were in New York City, there was a massive suspicionless, warrantless targeting program that targeted people from the Muslim community. They used license plate readers, for example, to target who was coming to and from mosques. This program failed to catch a single terrorist, was later deemed to be illegal, but those safeguards didn't prevent that from happening, right? The tools were there, and they were used even beyond the safeguards that existed. So mission creep, right? If the infrastructure is there, there's always the temptation to misuse it. Are safeguards effective? And will the fact of possession by the government of these tools lead to vulnerable communities, in particular, self-chilling their constitutional activity, like going to a place of worship or a protest? Lantern laws, New York City, 1731. Slaves were required to carry lanterns around. And hundreds of years later, with Bill de Blasio's administration, they proposed floodlighting those very same neighborhoods in order to supposedly keep people safer, but what those communities saw was an echo of the lantern laws. So I'm going to quickly sort of walk through, one particular scenario and kind of show where the various forms of AI move in this space. And this is policing and the criminal justice system. So police body cameras, all I'll say about them is that unfortunately, we have not succeeded in getting the right set of rules around them. And given that, they have not proven to be the kind of accountability tool many were expecting, right? They have actually more often now been used as a way to prosecute people who are caught on video in front of a police officer rather than, because of course the camera is pointing away from the officer, right? And that's its own challenge. But that is now potentially supercharged as well by face surveillance or facial recognition, right? The big five either have products in this space or are developing them. And it's not just about identification, right? Affect recognition is also a thing in face surveillance. So 2 NBA players, I think Darren Carlson and Gordon Hayward, if you're an NBA fan, the algorithm rated one of these men to be 57% happy and 0.1% angry, and the other one 39% happy and 27% angry. Guess which was which? I think you know, right? So I do want to make the point, though, that even a perfectly functioning, unbiased face surveillance system means that the government effectively doesn't have to figure out ahead of time who it follows around. Face surveillance is undetectable. It can be applied after the fact to any existing video, and there's more and more video out there. Okay, so the big five are the largest tech companies, which are Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. So I use that as a shorthand. Thank you, Henson. That's a good point out. Hansen, I think, mentioned earlier, the Chinese Surveillance Society and, the Uyghur Muslims really live right now in a surveillance society like no other, where the government openly talks about using surveillance tools to oppress that particular minority. But I think we shouldn't be as sanguine because, in fact, much of the same infrastructure is being rolled out in the United States. It is being rolled out not under the control necessarily of a single central government, but it is being rolled out with public safety arguments in mind. And many of the same tools that are used there are also being rolled out here with questions that should accompany that rolling out. I won't talk that much about big data policing, except to say that the traditional records management systems have now morphed into connected analytics systems that are able to point out, for example, who's potentially a gang member, who's potentially deportable, who's potentially a threat. And crimmigration as well blurs the lines between the criminal justice system and the immigration system. And then there's predictive policing. Right, as I said, which purports to determine where crime is either going to happen or who is going to commit a crime. Predictive risk assessment and conviction, right? So this is where it gets really interesting, which is tools that purport to determine how dangerous a person is and therefore either tell you how long they should be kept incarcerated or the conditions of their release. And predictive sentencing. Right, so the Compass tool, which gave a differing sentence to a black man who had committed a crime, the same crime as a white person, but got a sentence twice as long. And as it turns out, when you study the accuracy of these tools, they're really, again, reliant on historic data that skews them. And in fact, this particular tool, as you can see, had the bottom bars are African-American defendants and the top bars are white defendants. And as you can see, the African-American defendants are rated more likely to recidivate even if they don't. You don't have to look just at the criminal justice system. That was one example. But Virginia Eubanks has this concept of the digital poorhouse in which she talks about how these automated systems are in every area of our life. And these are just a few examples of cases from the past couple of years where, in Houston, student test data was processed by an algorithm and was used to rate and, in fact, fire some teachers. Public benefits were cut off by algorithm. Child welfare systems determined which children were removed from parental custody. Hours with disability caseworkers were cut by algorithm as well. So Virginia Eubanks and others kind of look at this as a massive live human test, but without safeguards, right? Because these tools are simply rolled out, and then we don't necessarily have the ability to figure out what to do. So what should we do, right? This is the very last piece of this puzzle. And what I really want to do is try to equip you all with a few critical questions that you can remember to ask when you see a given technology. What we've been trying to do is, with our coalition, is to slow down the building of the surveillance infrastructure, because again, if the infrastructure is there, then there's always the tendency to mission creep. But also to engage with big tech to ensure fairness, accountability, and transparency in the way that these tools are built. So we went to the Spheres at Amazon and delivered a large number of petitions. They actually let us in the building, which I was happy about. Centering the perspectives of impacted communities, right? So back to the question of whether it's data scientists' assumptions that go into these tools, or whether there's some mechanism by which a company can bring in the perspectives of those impacted communities. We've actually been pretty proactive here about legislation and regulation with our Seattle surveillance ordinance, and at the state level as well with a tech fairness bill that aims to surface the assumptions in these tools. I think if you ask one question, ask this question: what problem is the technology there to solve? It's amazing to me how often we just skip over that and go straight to the tech, right? What problem are you trying to solve with the tech? Does it actually solve that problem? And what are the rules and values around the tech? So my leave with you all is lead with the values, not with the tech, right? And talk about the impacts of that technology on human beings. And then how can you mitigate or accentuate desirable impacts, mitigate negative impacts. And if you find you can't, is there a mechanism to say no, right? So one of the questions we often skip over is this even an appropriate problem for technology to solve? And I think it's really important we ask that question first. Then you can talk about the mitigation, then you can talk about the rules, then you can talk about designing fairness into the product. So I'm going to end there, and I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion, because one of the members of our coalition, Theresa Crecelius from the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, is with us, who has been able to speak. You can read her bio. What I will say about her is she has been able to amazingly speak truth to power in corporate boardrooms of trillion-dollar corporations by talking about the impact of these technologies, not only on her personally, but also on her community. So thank you all.
Hello. My name is Theresa Crecelius, and I work for the American Muslim Empowerment Network, a program of the Muslim Association of Puget Sound that promotes justice and the civil rights of all, including American Muslims. And even though our country was built on religious freedom, American Muslims face religious bigotry, disproportionate scrutiny, warrantless monitoring, and unjustified government surveillance because of our faith and exercise of First Amendment rights. Thank you. I am a white American girl from Idaho who chose to convert to Islam, and I have personally experienced being under surveillance by the FBI. When I was a white girl, I had no contact with the FBI. Within a year of converting to Islam, I not only had been contacted by an FBI agent and harassed, but I had an FBI informant at my wedding. My family members and community members continually to be repeatedly harassed by the FBI. Now we have legislation that distinctly discriminates against Muslims, also known as the Muslim ban, and the targeting, monitoring, and surveillance of American Muslims perpetuates the negative stereotypes and a fear-based narrative that have also resulted in the highest levels of hate crimes and bias incidents against American Muslims in our nation's history. My own father-in-law was violently murdered while he was praying in an anti-Muslim hate attack almost 3 years ago. So I've directly experienced both government surveillance and the dangerous consequences of the fear-based narrative that such surveillance engenders. Many others in the American Muslim community have also been directly impacted. I specifically went with the Community Coalition with Shankar and the ACLU to talk with Microsoft and Amazon about their facial recognition software. And powerful tools like facial recognition only give the government more power to surveil American Muslims and other minority communities. Experience shows us that law enforcement cannot be trusted to use such technology without violating the rights of minority communities. Once these tools are in the hands of law enforcement, it will be very difficult to reel back or apply meaningful rules to these tools. That's why it's so important to consult marginalized and targeted groups before releasing any of these surveillance tools. Do you want me to just keep going, or do you want to ask me specific questions? Okay.
Maybe Shankar back up as well.
Yeah.
The intention here was really just to give you a sense of some of the important questions that even in your professional lives, as you're contemplating bringing some of these technologies, is to think about, well, what questions do we need to ask? And you'll hear from Claudia Chang after lunch, thinking about what values are most important to you, your stakeholders, your organization. So as Shankar said, that those values are front of mind before you make the decision around the technology. And so the fact that both Shankar and Theresa have had these conversations with some big 5 tech companies and asked those questions, what would you say? I'll ask a question, then see if anybody else wants to respond before we go on. What's the best way to engage with the people who are creating these technologies to make them aware and ask the right questions of them? How do you go about that?
Well, I think by city-wise setting up community work groups like we have with the safety ordinance that Shankar was talking about, that requires the city to approach community work groups before implementing new technologies. So having those types of laws in place before the technology is available to the government.
And Shankar, how receptive have some of these companies been to these conversations with you? Obviously, they let you into the spheres, so they're okay with that.
Well, yeah, yes, because the spheres are very pretty and are actually, might have put me in a better mood when I was delivering the petitions, right? I'll say, to also answer the previous question, that it's an inside and outside strategy that involves engagement, right, and rewarding positive behavior. For example, when Microsoft put out principles and acknowledged a responsibility around facial recognition, right? That was a good start. But keeping the external pressure on as well, because we didn't think necessarily that the safeguards they proposed were adequate for facial recognition. But this is also a movement that engages tech workers, academics, members of Congress, right? There's a growing wave, I think, of groups that are demanding more accountability, fairness, and transparency in technology. I think all of those groups together have started to get some traction on the problem in 2018. So I think we can build on that.
My final question to both of you is, the scenario that we're playing with right now involves an airport and thinking about how to make life better by using these technologies on traffic and everything else and making policy decisions. If our students or our graduates or our community members were in a position to actually start evaluating these technologies, how could they best listen to vulnerable communities before making a decision? What's the best way to engage so that they're aware of some of these? Because the airport especially definitely impacts vulnerable communities. Is there a particular way to think or to listen?
I think that we need to build those mechanisms. So, I'll take Microsoft because we've had a couple of Microsoft speakers, right? So they are creating a committee called Ether that has a number of subcommittees, that are supposed to look at, for example, problematic uses of the technology, operationalizing ethics in the way technology is built, bias, and various others. I think what they don't quite have yet, and what we're encouraging them to do, is in each of those spaces building in mechanisms where the community can come in at at phase one, right? So at the very, very beginning, because often, as I previously said, some of the most important questions are not asked at the outset, and that impacts the entire trajectory of the build cycle of the technology. So that, it's much harder if you've decided what the product is for and built it to then call in community members and say, hey, what do you think of this, right? And so building that habit, right, that sort of fast twitch muscle that says, wait a minute, what assumptions are we not thinking of, and who's not at the table to be able to articulate those?
What question would you like to hear if somebody consulted with you?
I would ask everyone that's considering implementing new technologies to recognize that our society is based in institutionalized racism, and is the program that you want to implement going to continue that racism or dismantle it? And to start that conversation by inviting community members in so you can learn about the historical impacts of the racist society that we've all been living in.
Thank you, Theresa. I'd like to take a couple minutes to take a few questions from anybody here. I'm going to come down here. I hold the microphone, so.
Oh, okay. I just had a legal question. If we have these new technologies available, say law enforcement gets them one way or the other, is the system of establishing probable cause, getting a warrant, and then using them, is that sufficient, or do we need something completely brand new?
I would say it's, the courts have not been, the courts are important. I want to say that first, right? Because right now, in some ways, in the absence of legislators touching this space and putting proactive frameworks of transparency in place, we still have the courts as a backstop. I think courts have been challenged to try to apply the principles of, say, the Fourth Amendment, but and due process and equal protection to things like surveillance technologies, because in many instances, they present questions of first impression, right? Is warrantless, suspicionless, generalized surveillance, by just pointing a camera out in a public square and using face surveillance on that, enough of a game changer to warrant restriction under the Fourth Amendment? I would say, based on the previous trajectory of Supreme Court cases, you could make that case. Am I confident the Supreme Court is going to say yes to that? I'm not. So that's why we also are encouraging and educating lawmakers with this exact sort of presentation and the critical questions to ask, and moving legislation this year in Olympia, which we're calling the tech fairness legislation, to proactively surface these technologies and at least have some minimum standards of fairness, so we're not just relying on the courts to establish protections for us.
It's a really important question. That's why I say this is a very crucial window of time for all of these decisions. Our general rule of thumb, and Shankar might have changed, is that we always say that when it comes to tech innovation, the legal system is usually 10 to 20 years behind catching up to it and being able to manage it accordingly. And so a lot of things are going to happen before they can catch up. I don't know if that has changed, but it probably still is a lag.
I mean, it's a long way behind. We are litigating in the automated decision system space. We are also litigating in the surveillance space, but it is painfully slow. And as I said, how do you bring a case if you don't know you've been surveilled? How do you establish the harm? How do you know an automated decision system was what caused your public benefits checks to disappear, right? Often, people come to us when something very strange and suspicious happens, but those transparency mechanisms aren't there to help us understand why. So those cases are just tough, resource intensive to bring, and that's why I think we need to push our policymakers as well to put the proactive frameworks in place.
So our intention wasn't to bring you a downer in the middle of the day with this presentation, but it really is important that we ask the right questions, and I think we still want to proceed with maybe with a bit of the sentiment Vinay has, is that we are looking to improve, to make life better, but we can't do so without having this front of mind, that values conversation and who's impacted. I saw a hand. Sorry about all the feedback, guys.
So, as tech companies are hiring these developers, would it help if they are coming from these vulnerable and diverse backgrounds right when they're from the get-go, so that they would be able to provide this perspective when they're building a particular product?
Yes, I think that would definitely help to have people of color and also women in the room when these decisions are being made. Otherwise, it's just one aspect, and if the executives are all in one social circle, social bubble, they don't know what's happening outside of their circle.
And to add to that, I mean, I've heard personal stories as well from, for example, an African-American developer at one of the big five who, was talking about a technology. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was essentially a profiling-based technology that everyone else in the room who was white was very big on. And, he was the one who had to step in there and say, wait a minute, this sounds an awful lot like, not only a lawsuit waiting to happen, but also something that will impact my community differentially. And I think it does, as much as we think that everyone has those perspectives, I think it really takes that personal experience in the room, and tech doesn't have enough of it right now.
I think that's a really important question, and even on my LinkedIn feed. By the way, I encourage you to reach out to all of our speakers and connect to them on LinkedIn. I think they probably will accept your invitation. But I've been seeing a lot of LinkedIn updates recently from younger people of color saying, I'm so excited, this is my first day at Amazon, my first day at Microsoft. I think there's at least a nascent recognition that they have to think differently about hiring. I'm just curious, in terms of a right of response, either from Vinay or Noel, whether you're seeing any kind of initiative on the hiring front in tech to represent that diversity of thought.
Yeah, I think I actually heard a lot about it. I've heard a lot about how important this is my entire career. For 20 years, we've been saying, we should totally do this. I've only now, in the last 3 years, realized, we just do a lot of talking about, we should totally do this. And so I got very cognizant about what practices are we doing in a company that actually solve the problem. And so Microsoft has actually been trying to implement things like that, but Amazon was trying. I mean, it's a very hard problem to solve because the people trying to solve the problem are, how do I say this without saying it, kind of part of the problem, right? So what I got passionate about was getting people like me, and that's why I take the stage as many times as I can, is to show other people that look like me or talk like me or feel like me, you can do that. And to be an example and to get more examples and hope that that will somehow turn the tide, because we have to be in leadership positions. We have to influence decisions. And if we quit before we ever get that, I just made director at Microsoft, and I have been fighting for director, which I should have gotten years. I had that title a long time ago. Anyway, it was literally a glass ceiling. I didn't know what that felt like until the last 3 years of my life where I'm like, ugh. It was terrible. But it takes people like us sticking with it and staying with it. So I want to give in case you want to say.
No, I think actually there's definitely a lot of opportunity for companies to be more aggressive. I know at HTC we've taken a huge community approach to things, and not just in our hiring, but also how we're using the technology. Also even may challenge, I feel like the technology groups or industry in general is maybe a little more progressive in that. We have active policies and things that we try to do, both diversity, not just in race and gender, but also just different points of view. It's super critical, especially if you're building platforms, right? So I think it's definitely a movement there. There needs to be a better movement, not just in technology, but also in other industries as well.
I think that's a very important call to action. I'm going to take one more question, which conveniently is right next to me.
Hi. Bill Mannion from Pattern Computer. In the EU in May, they passed a law called GDPR, which is basically a consumer data protection law. And it includes a clause that requires not only disclosure of how your data is going to be used, but also the requirement to explain how decisions were rendered in an automated decision process. So I really have a two-part question. Part one is, do you think that type of law goes far enough? And do you see action to create a national law, a federal law in that regard in the United States, and when that might occur?
That's a good question, because we keep thinking the Europeans are going to save us, right?
Right. The Europeans are not going to save us, but they're a long way ahead of where we are, I think, is the short answer. I think there's, the single best thing about GDPR is it actually has teeth, right? And there's a way to enforce. There's a regulator who can flesh out what the definitions mean. And they have taken steps towards algorithmic transparency, as you say. I don't think it's enough. I think where the field is moving is towards a much more complete, proactive reporting and analysis of what the system does, why it's necessary to solve a given problem, and having some space of public comment around that. And that actually is the model that the Tech Fairness Bill in Washington follows. But I think GDPR is step one. In Washington, there's actually a data privacy bill that sort of has GDPR language in it, and it's actually being pushed by Microsoft right now. Unfortunately, and this is my personal opinion, obviously, Microsoft may disagree, but every standard in that bill is significantly watered down from where it is in GDPR. And it's not entirely clear to me that it obligates the companies to do very much. So as I told the prime sponsor, the impetus for this bill is the house is on fire because there is no protection for data right now. Unfortunately, the problem with this bill is also that the house is on fire and you're taking a very small bucket and flinging it against the side of the house. So I don't necessarily see the feds acting anytime soon. I hope we have room in the states to create stronger mechanisms, and I think, my hope is there's political will in Washington state to do that. We'll see this session.
Well, Theresa and Shankar, thank you so much for, I guess, a reality check, but also to think more critically about this. Like I mentioned, Shankar probably will stick around a few minutes, but can't stay for the rest of the day. But of course, reach out to him. He's incredibly responsive. And then Theresa, I believe, will you stick around for a little longer if anybody has any questions? Yeah, so she'll be here for a little bit as well. So I think it's really important if you have the opportunity to connect with them over lunch. And thank you very much for sharing that perspective.
Thank you.
And with that, here is Molly.
Microphones now.
Yeah.
Need all of them. Okay, who's hungry? A little bit. So about food. So first of all, we will have a chance during activity 2. We're going to continue the conversation after lunch, and that conversation about values, specifically looking at organizational values and your connection to your personal values with Claudia Chang. And then after that, you'll have a chance to digest this information and revert back to that activity in activity number 1 and think about values and ethics and everything that you're hearing that. So you'll have a chance to digest that and put it in context. But first, let's get you fed. So there is a buffet on this end of the room and on this end of the room. There's all kinds of beverages and granola bars and fruit in the back of the room. So I encourage the room to kind of split in half. Some of you go over there, some over here to kind of reduce lines. We are going to reconvene at 1:30, so there's plenty of time to eat. There's plenty of food. And yeah, enjoy.